Hello coders, welcome to episode 198. Let's talk about deploying WordPress with an up-to-date version of PHP. Now, I was asked fairly recently to come up with an example of WordPress, a WordPress thing that I've built. I decided to build myself a WordPress plugin, and before doing so, I realized that ages ago I had built a WordPress installation on a GitHub repo using Docker. But as I mentioned, this was a long time ago, and the PHP version was 7.1, and the version of WordPress was very old. And so what I wanted to do was, before I built this plugin, was to actually upgrade WordPress to be the latest version of WordPress and to upgrade the version of PHP to 8.2. So today, we're going to be talking about how I actually went about to do that, and also the other additional things that I've added to that. So, it uses WP Packagist, which is the WordPress Packagist, I guess you would call it, packages database. So it's very similar to Packagist, which is the Composer package database. So you can use like Composer require, and you can require a package. You can do with a similar thing using WP Packagist, which is the WordPress plugins and themes, which is great, but usually this means putting everything in the vendor directory. That's the first challenge, right? So we have to change where things live, because WordPress requires themes to be in the themes folder and plugins to be in the plugins folder, and for these to be in, say, the WP content folder and things like that, right? There's also the WordPress admin that needs to go somewhere. So WordPress, the standard WordPress installation is not, say, a typical PHP application installation at the minute, right? So you need to come up with these installers, or have a set of installers that put these things in the various places, and then tell WordPress tell Composer, where these things live. You then need to use the Composer autoloader and Bootstrap to work out where those things live, to require those particular files, right? So that was a challenge. Now this is all in the code repo, so you can go and see how I've done that, and it's using well-known tools to handle all of those particular instances of moving things out of vendor and putting them into their own places, and then having the ability to tell Composer where those things actually live, right? Okay, so that's the files and the structure of the files out of the way. So we have the WordPress admin in its own WP folder, we have the plugins in its own plugins folder in a content directory, and we have the themes in a themes folder in its content directory as well, which means that when I go and upgrade those particular things via Composer, then they will go in the right places, which does mean that I no longer, and I really recommend people don't do this anyway, I don't use the WordPress plugin installation process. You know, the standard process where you just install it through a button. I'm scared of buttons. Buttons don't always work. I much prefer the command line. These GUI interfaces, they're not great. And I will try and avoid, where possible, not to upgrade systems and plugins through buttons, right? So I like to know what's under the hood. So don't upgrade WordPress through the button interface by pressing a button to upgrade to a particular version. There are so many things that could go wrong. So yes, so Composer now has total control over the versions of the plugins and the themes, as well as the WordPress core itself. Okay, so that was the first challenge. The second challenge was to let's get all of this onto a Docker image, right? So this Docker image is publicly available. It's using PHP 8.2 at the minute, and it puts WordPress in I think it's the var wub HTML folder, and then it presents you with the WordPress site as it should do. Now, the biggest challenge I had was, what do I do first? Do I upgrade WordPress, because I believe it was on something like 5.3 or something like that, some really old version of WordPress, and then do I upgrade PHP, or do I do it the other way? And then how do I know that WordPress, the upgraded version of WordPress, is actually going to work on this version of PHP? And how do I know the plugins that I require need to are compatible as well? This is where the continual integration pipeline, which I've included in this installation, comes in. So this continual integration pipeline does a whole manner of things. First of all, and this was the first thing I added after I put in the Composer stuff. This was the first thing I did before upgrading any packages. This is the first thing I did. First thing was I added PHP Stan, static analysis. I added PHP mess detector. I added PHP compatibility checkers. I added Rector. I added various different tools, build tools and analysis tools, to ensure that the code that I was upgrading on WordPress was actually correct. And of course, things like PHP CS, the code sniffer that I added, that required its own set of rules, and those rules had to be the rules that were defined by WordPress, right? So they would have their own rule set. Same with PHP Stan. I would go and create a baseline for the PHP Stan to be aware of, and then I would slowly reduce that over time as things started to be upgraded. So then, once I had those tools in place, I was then able to run those tools across WordPress to ensure that I'm actually able to upgrade to a different version. To say, hey, I want to upgrade to PHP 8.1, let's say. So let's just make sure that the current code that I'm currently using is okay with that. Because as I said in one of my other episodes, WordPress, I think it's 6.3, can in beta quotes, air quotes, use PHP 8, but that's in beta. So it's up to you as a developer to ensure that that's actually correct. And so this is what the continual integration pipeline did. I then got fed up with having to run all this locally. So that's where the pipeline really took off, and I actually created some GitHub actions, right? So a merge into a pull request, that once gets approved now has to go through this GitHub pipeline, continual integration pipeline, to ensure that any changes are okay, which means that later on when I upgrade to the next version of WordPress or the next version of PHP, I'm in a better place to ensure that nothing falls over. And that is pretty much the code side of it. We also have, as I mentioned, the Docker side of it. So there's a Docker Compose file that handles the PHP installation, or PHP container, and the database as well, so you can spin that up locally. And then once that was there, I then started working on the plugin. So that took a couple of days just to sort of flesh out and do, and I'm very happy with the way it is. I'll leave a link in the show notes below for that. I then started to create a WordPress plugin that I could then install into this updated WordPress installation. And it was pretty much a carbon copy of the WordPress installation in the sense that the pipelines were the same. So the GitHub action pipeline was pretty much the same. The continual integration stuff, that was pretty much the same. So I was using the same tools, using the same standards, all of that stuff. But I was writing it in a way that wasn't connected directly to WordPress. So I mentioned earlier about writing plugins that aren't directly opinionated or using the opinions of the framework that you're writing them for. So perhaps you're writing a plugin that is can be used in various different frameworks, and therefore you want to abstract some of the business logic, so we say, out of that. I haven't gone down the rabbit hole so far, really far yet, but what I'm thinking of is even abstracting that code out into another repository, which means that then becomes a dependency of the WordPress plugin, a dependency of perhaps a Magento plugin, or perhaps a Concrete 5 plugin, that kind of stuff. So you're actually really abstracting out what the plugin does, and then you're only hooking into the various things that framework needs to use that plugin. That kind of way of thinking. But as I'm sure you can appreciate, that's quite a complicated thing to do, and the remit was just to come up with an example of something that I've done in WordPress. So there was no need for me really to go that one step further. And so far it's worked pretty well. The plugin that I've created is very basic. It is just like a list of books that I've read from Goodreads. And it's a private plugin, so I'm not putting this out live, right? So it's a private plugin that I'm going to use to demonstrate some of my skills. And it takes books that I've read off of Goodreads, and it presents them in a grid format. I guess in the future I could present them in a sort of a carousel format or whatever, but there is like an admin section to this plugin which allows you to change which bookshelf you're pulling your books from, or how many books you want to pull down, that kind of stuff. It then caches it as well, because it comes back as an RSS feed, so it caches the response, which means that it's not hitting that RSS feed all the time. For every page refresh, it's caching that. When I was working on the WordPress installation, I would then go into the plugins folder and then basically do a git clone of my plugin into there, and that would be my way of locally installing it in. Obviously, in the future, if I was to ever publish this plugin, then I would need to put this in perhaps WP Packages or whatnot. But I do have plans for upgrading this plugin in the future, but it's really, 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 really time dependent. Now, weirdly, it was only a couple of weeks back we were actually talking about, I think it was in episode 196, how to get WordPress off of PHP 7.4, right? And I didn't realize it at the time that that's what I would be doing myself. And here I am. I managed to get WordPress off of PHP, I think it was 7.1 at the time, and onto WordPress 6.3 using Docker. Now, as I mentioned, the caveats are that plugins and themes have to be installed through Composer, right? So we're not relying on the GUI interface of installing and upgrading plugins or the WordPress core, which freak me out whenever I see people doing that because they have no idea what's going on in the background. And upgrading WordPress is, if you want to try and be doing that in a safe environment, away from production, as far away from production as possible, and trying to get, in my opinion, WordPress containerized through Docker. There is a README, there is an explanation of how you actually set this thing up. If you've got any questions, you know what to do, get in contact. This is obviously going to be on YouTube at How to Code Well. It's also going to be on Spotify, but you can get in contact through Twitter, through Instagram, Facebook, whatever. It's just How to Code Well in all the places. But this is all I wanted to talk about today. I'm busy doing other bits and pieces myself. I am also in the job market myself. I am, as I mentioned before, interviews, talking to people about different requirements and all sorts of shenanigans, technical tests and whatnot. So I am busy building these things out. So things might get a little bit sporadic whilst that happens, but thank you for bearing with me. Happy coding, everyone. Lots of love, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers. Bye-bye.